Hi y'all. For those who don't know me, I'm Mandy Medley, and I'm one of the worker owners here at Pilsen Community Books. And it is I don't need to be in. Hi, you too.
Yeah, come be famous.
Okay. It is a really huge honor to host this event tonight. I'll keep this short because I know why you all are here, but I wanted to do a quick introduction. Annie Howard, who is a dear friend, is a historian, journalist, and urbanist based in Bridgeport, not far from here. Day to day, Annie is a housing organizer fighting to pass the just cause for eviction ordinance, which would prevent people from being displaced without reason. Her writing has appeared in a variety of outlets, and she's compiled her favorite works into 3 zines, which we have here, and she also has with her tonight, and other that can be purchased here, and other fine purveyors of self-published works across the city of Chicago. And also right now, Annie is doing a fundraiser for some very important healthcare, and she has a link here. We'll put it up at the counter after the program, but you can also talk more about that too. And our guest of honor here tonight, whose book we're here to celebrate. And I'm going to do a very short bio, but I know that Annie and Helen will talk much more about her long career. Helen Shiller, raised by migrant Jewish parents, was radicalized by the anti-war and civil rights movements. Shiller was in a collective of whites aligned with the Black Panther Party in Chicago. Beginning in 1987, Shiller was a radical Chicago alderperson for 24 years. Thank you both, Annie and Helen.
Well, I think we're going to start off with a little excerpt from one of the chapters. Do you want to take it away?
Sure. So I'm starting. This is I'm going to read a chapter that's focused in the mid 1970s, and I make reference to the newspaper printed and distributed by us. The Black Panther Party newspaper, as well as Keep Strong magazine, which is a magazine that we published from 1975 to 1980. So I just reference them. Just mentioning that because you might not know what I'm talking about. All right, so I'm just going to read for a few minutes, but this is an excerpt from the book that really focuses on Chicago's master plan, or the Chicago 21 plan, and seemed to be appropriate for here. The fighting the master plan. I'm going to jump around just a little and skip a few things just to make it shorter. Our relationship to the Black Panther Party and our responsibility for distribution of the paper put us in touch with organizations throughout Chicago. The more stories we covered in Keep Strong about housing and urban renewal, the more the similarity of issues facing Chicago's other neighborhoods became apparent. Black, brown, white, Latino, Asian, Native American. If you are a community of poor and working families and households, you are on someone's chopping block, or you are being left out there alone to fend for yourself. Major cities across the country were developing master plans. It made us think. Chicago must have one as well. With Susan Rosenblum as a researcher, we learned of the Chicago 21 plan. The 125-page plan had been drafted for the city by the architectural firm Skidmore, Owings & Merrill and released in May 1973. Providing a vision for Chicago in the 21st century, it laid out a $15 billion plan for overhauling downtown Chicago. The plan envisioned a downtown where upper middle class families could live and thrive, while targeting surrounding communities, poor and working people, often of color, lived, and where we were in touch with activists who were equally determined to stabilize their own communities of Cabrini Green, Pilsen, Kenwood Oakland, Uptown, Westtown Humboldt Park, and East Garfield Park, all of whom were concerned that the 21 plan would lead to the urban renewal, increasingly referred to as gentrification, and displacement of their community and the people who live there. Joined by the Chicago Housing Tenant Organization, the Kenwood Oakland Community Organization, the Puerto Rican Socialist Party in Westtown, and CASA in Pilsen, the Heart of Uptown Coalition formed the campaign to stop the Chicago 21 plan. We saw the 21 plan as an intention to develop a two-tiered city to further segregate Chicago economically and racially. The plan envisioned the restructuring of the industrial base in Pilsen into market-rate housing. The area on the north side that included Cabrini Green had the same intention, albeit with its priority to remove the pesky problem of more than 10,000 poor and black people. If successful, the waves of development going north, south, and west would greatly disrupt the existing communities. In 1971, the powers that be thought downtown needed a buffer between the city center and the overwhelmingly black South Side. The majority of the forces behind the 21 plan were focusing their attention on a large vacant tract of land in the South Loop. While today the South Loop is a swanky neighborhood, that was far from the case in 1975. Nearly a century earlier, Dearborn Station, located in the South Loop, was built to serve the many railroads coming to downtown Chicago from the south. In 1971, however, it was abandoned as Amtrak consolidated their trains at Union Station, leaving a 51-acre site of rail-covered vacant land. Dearborn Park was a development pushed by the 21 Plan's visionaries and directors as a result of the future, as a vision of the future. Located directly across from 11th and State, where the police headquarters was then located, it was to be the catalyst for the reinvention of the South Loop. Dearborn Park was to be a model community of owner condominiums on low-rises and townhomes, By 1977, plans for the first of two phases were nearly completed. In previous years, condo conversions were on a fast track, and with no regulations, abuses were rampant. Complaints were growing, and changes were being demanded. The Dearborn Park developers took notice. In response to some of their critics, they promised to require all owners to live in their units for at least 2 years. They promised diverse ethnicities. In fact, they argued this would be a new opportunity for black middle-class families to live in a safe, integrated community near the heart of Chicago's downtown. In such a segregated community, how could anyone object? For those concerned about affordable housing, they promised an affordable senior high-rise building. They also promised to build a model public school in the Dearborn Park station. We weren't swayed, although we did find it ironic that realtors who now touted these promises for their model community lobbied against them elsewhere in the city. We were opposing Dearborn Park to raise the bigger question of how and for whom development in Chicago was taking place. We wanted policies to change. We wanted people of color and those with lower incomes to be welcome in our city and to have policies that protected us and improved our lives. In 1979, I became the executive director of the Employment Action Coalition with my office at the Community Renewal Society. That must have given me some legitimacy because soon after, I was invited by the architects of the Chicago 21 Plan to participate in a tour through the South Loop, Pilsen, and the near West Side. By now, Phase 1 at Dearborn Park was completed, with planning for Phase 2 well underway. During the wrap-up, at the end of the tour, I joined the group to hear a brief presentation by members of the Dearborn Park Corporate Board. Somewhere along the line, a year or so earlier, we had concluded that we had lost this particular battle to stop this first phase of Dearborn Park and the redevelopment of the South Loop. We therefore turned our attention elsewhere, we being all of the coalition members. Suddenly, I heard the words. There was significant opposition to this development. We came close to being stopped. The speaker was looking directly at me, and I realized in that moment that we had given up too soon. Although we couldn't claim any victory in battling the Chicago 21 Plan, we gained a lot. Virtually all our partners engaged in one or more survival programs in their communities, not unlike the programs in which we engaged in Uptown. There was synergy with the work of the Intercommunal Survival Committee and our fledgling mass organization, the Heart of Uptown Coalition. We bonded, building trust and a close working relationship with others doing similar work, largely because we were each based in our own communities, doing the work and bringing that practice and experience to the table. The Chicago 21 Plan was as much a vision as a plan. For me, that vision of Chicago was representative of the divergent realities Chicagoans live with every day. It would dovetail seamlessly with the Democratic machine's opportunism and the emerging Me First Republican agenda as the 1970s drew to a close, signaling the turn in national politics and Ronald Reagan's trickle-down economics view, which stressed an antipathy to the social programs of FDR's New Deal and Johnson's war on poverty. Everything from the national passenger train system to public education, local public transit, public housing and welfare, even Social Security and Medicare face derision and privatization. That's my piece.
So I know when we talked yesterday and we talked about why you were choosing that passage, you mentioned it because it includes Pilsen and working across the city. One of the things, so I interviewed Helen and wrote about the book and also the current context of Uptown for the Chicago Reader. And one of the things I pointed out in the book, you were very adamant that Uptown is not special,
Yeah.
right? I would argue otherwise, but it's a good thing to think about. But I think what this shows is that the issues that face the city as a whole face the whole city. And there are also issues, of course, that resonate in other cities as well. And this was a moment where you were trying to make connections across the city. So can you talk a little bit more about Pilsen's role in what you just read?
So, well, from I came to Chicago in 1972, and very shortly after I came to Chicago in 1972. I was recruited to come here to work with a group that was being formed, that was to be a cadre of white people working under the direction of the Black Panther Party, organizing white people to join the Black-led struggle for liberation. That was our goal. That was our objective. That's why I came to Chicago, and we focused on Uptown because Uptown had the highest concentration of poor white people in the city, arguably in the country. It also was the home for one of the largest concentrations of Native people in and urban communities. It was also had the oldest Black community, albeit small, outside of the Black Belt in Chicago. And it was the southern end of the ward, which Uptown was in, or half. Uptown was divided in half, and the southern half of Uptown shared the northern edge of Lakeview, which at that point in time was 75% Puerto Rican, largely people who had been displaced consistently from one community to another on the north side, having been forced out of the area where Sandburg Village was built in the 50s, and then Lincoln Park in the 60s and 70s, and now in soon to be actually from Lakeview as well, but now that's where they were before moving on to Westtown and Humboldt Park. We had very quickly through I think initially through the work we were doing, we connected with Rudy Lozano and Art Vasquez and Tomas Santana in Pilsen. And because we were always involved in selling the paper, we were always involved in talking about issues that were in the Black Panther paper, and they all resonated with people in our communities. And we began to not only distribute the paper in Uptown, but we distributed it in communities throughout the city where the Black Panther Party chapter was not. So we were we came to Pilsen, we came to Westtown, we went to areas where they were not, and also where obviously we could expand our home distribution route to include white people that we wanted to recruit to the Black-led struggle for liberation. In the process, creating many different coalitions, and one of those was with CASA, who were not only Rudy was not only involved in Chicago, but was involved nationally, especially in California. The notion being that that the borders were irrelevant when it came to the economy and the impact and the integration of, or the fear, the actual integration or involvement, if you will, of Mexicans in the U.S. economy and vice versa. So that became very much a part of a lot of the work we were doing. And then also in the in 1974, we began a year-long campaign with the Young Lords Organization to elect Chacha Jimenez alderman of the 46th Ward. And Chacha was very involved in citywide and in the state in multiple conversations and organizations that were dealing with Latino agendas. And which further put us in touch with folks at CASA, and then shortly thereafter with the farm workers, who had sent people to Chicago. Marcus Munoz was here organizing the farm workers' boycott against lettuce and grapes, which we took on as an objective of ours on the north side. We took on responsibility for that. So we had a lot of different ways in which we interacted and communicated with a lot of people. From the very beginning, we consistently were engaged in efforts for community control of police, The leadership in that came from the Black Panther Party that was demanding that for many years, especially after the murder of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. And in 1972, we held in Uptown a conference to end, a rally to end police brutality and establish community control. And then we're very much a part of organizing people to participate in a conference that was organized by the Black Panther Party at the University of Illinois at Circle Campus in 1973 in June, where leadership from across the country, especially Black leadership from across the country, came to join them in demanding community control of police, but also in disseminating a model for it, ordinance for it, that they had been developing all year long. And that immediately put us into a campaign for community control, which was focused around community control of police, which was relevant in all of our communities. The other thing that was relevant in all our communities was what was the planning that was going on, and what was the city's planning, and what was going to go on and how it was going to impact our communities. Prior to us being aware of the Chicago 21 plan, what we were aware of intimately was the fact that the city's planning department the way they did planning was they'd identify a community that they didn't really care about, and they'd identify an institution that they did care about, and they'd find a way to argue that it would help that community, and in the process it eliminated that community. So UIC was a good example of that. That ironically was an immigrant community that was more white than anything else, but of course they didn't care because it was an immigrant community they control over, and it was also Italian, so they was questionable at that time. The people who survived in all of that, and the way the communities were built, and there's like almost gated communities surrounding that, were really the aldermen from the first and the, who was Marzullo from 25? Yeah, who were largely known to be, at least as far as I knew, have strong connections to the mob. So there was all this other intricate kind of stuff going on. On the north side, it was very similar at Cabrini, where the police were as much a part of, they were at both sides of the crime, creating it and defending against it, supposedly, or fighting it, supposedly. And Marion Stamps and the Chicago Tenant Housing Organization that she created were very much key in creating over and over and over again truces among the gangs in order to be able to create peace in the community for the people who are living there. And the biggest issue consistently was there was no cooperation with the police. And just as an aside, I just realized in 1969, when I came to Chicago for an SDS demonstration, it was this, the Weathermen were having one demonstration, Days of Rage, and RIM 2, which is what I was part of, we're having another one in conjunction with the Black Panther Party and the labor movement, and we were sort of progressive labor, and it was a demonstration around the closing of plants like International Harvester, and we marched there. It was thousands of people. We marched there, and the Cobra Stones were actually organized by, I would argue, a combination of the Red Squad, the FBI, COINTELPRO, the police, Red Squad was the police department, and the administration, to disrupt our march. And I was in that area of the march when the Cobra Stones came after us. Mm-hmm. Fortunately, the Black Panther Party had our back, and we were okay. Mm-hmm. And we got out of it, and we stood our ground, and were able to move on. And I really have no idea how that all worked out, but it did. And I think it was illustrative in retrospect of the kind of tension and dynamic that's consistently existed, because there has always been some integration. There's always been collusion. And usually that is one that's very manipulative. And then whenever anyone progressive has attempted to create principled relationships and to try and organize some of the people who are engaged in illegal activity to turn that around to be service to the people, they would be attacked or demonized for it. And you can see that in the FBI files on Fred Hampton. There's a ton of files that reflect that, and the FBI's attempt to make sure that didn't work. There was, in my conversations with, and some of my notes from back in the day with Chacha Jimenez, but also recent conversations that I had with him, when I showed him the book, he pointed out to me that they had a whole plan for dealing with the drug dealing that was going around their building in Lakeview in 74 and 75, leading up to the election, that was really disrupting people's lives. And they had a program for it, and they were working with people, and they were turning it around, and they asked the police to, at one point, just to station a police vehicle on the street in order to discourage the on the street activity so they could deal with the stabilization of the housing that people were living in. And the police commander, who later went to jail for corruption, refused to do that and said he wouldn't deal with them. So this is a constant tension. I've totally gone off the subject. But the point is that that was consistently the case, and it was true for our conversations about what was going on in Pilsen as well, which is what I was trying to get to. So we had, the coalition, I think, was really important because what it did was it brought people from all parts of the city into conversations that reflected reflected a number of things. One, that we had so much in common. Two, that we were actually doing very common things, common sense things that were commonly addressing the same issues, but as they manifested themselves in our own community. And so that when Harold Washington became the candidate and we were struggling to make sure that there was support for him and that there was a progressive support from him from every community, one of the issues that came up, education was a very big deal. Because it was because there was so much miseducation going on, and I talk a little bit of several chapters about this in the book. But one example of that, one issue that was a big issue was bilingual education, which outside of the Latino community really was not well understood. And Manfred Bird had been a deputy superintendent who had been passed over by Jane Byrne, even though he was better qualified than the person she appointed to be the superintendent. And then it became an issue, and Harold clearly was going to appoint him. It was before the election, but that was the conversation, and that he would be Harold would support him. And there was a lot of questions because at one point early on, Manfred Bird had some issues about bilingual education. So this ended up, I think especially Rudy, Chuy, Juan Vasquez really took the lead. We met at St. Pius Church, I remember vividly, several forums with Manfred Bird to really where he was really educated about why this was such a big deal. And where there was a lot of conversation that ultimately partially led to, I'm sure, what was a very strong Black Latino unity, at least among progressives in the city, and led to Harold's commitment to create the Latino Commission, which he was going to appoint Chuy to be the head of. Rudy to be the head of. And that was all shortly after he was first elected, and he did create it, and it did change the whole way in which he approached dealing with these different commissions changed forever the way the city would deal with people of diverse histories in the city, even if they didn't go quite as far, and as the changes that Harold began didn't quite go quite to the extent that we had hoped or hoped for them. Many of the things, including this one thing, had a long-term impact in Chicago, I think, and was the seeds that really were important that were planted during that time. So Pilsen played a really important role in Harold's election and afterwards, even though on the face of it, you might look at it and say, well, on the special, no one won for alderman until the special election, and even then it was tough and blah, blah, blah. The work that was done by our coalition partners and by the folks here was critical to really wearing down the machine and changing the representation in the city council. Absolutely, without a doubt.
One thing that everybody just got to see that Helen does so well is just freestyle across a lot of different history. But you did come back to the question at the end,
come
so
around.
you came all the way around. It's good.
Sorry.
No, it's great. It's great.
It's kind of
There's a lot of history though, but. I want to talk a little bit specifically about Uptown, though, because you land here in '72.
Yeah.
paint a picture for us. You mentioned the use of institutions to disrupt neighborhoods, and in Uptown that was especially the Truman College, which is now right next to the Wilson Red Line stop. What was it like to land there, to be organizing your neighbors? Yeah, if you could just talk a little bit about what it looked like.
So there was already a history of organizing in Uptown before we got there. SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, had people from XDS had in around 1965, I think, give or take, moved into Uptown, started doing organizing. They started a group called Join, which was Jobs and Income Now, and they connected with multiple people, sort of a few different groups of people. There was a very strong group that was both black and white, the leadership of welfare mothers who were demanding welfare reform and working for that. And they ultimately were the founders of what was a mass organization at the time called Voice of the People, and which was very involved in the fight against the initial location for Truman College. And before I get into that, they also started working, or they had some effect on what ended up being young people who were in a gang called the Goodfellows, who were constantly in conflict with the police, who decided to become political, and they became the Young Patriots, and ultimately connected with the Young Lords and the Black Panther Party to be part of the Rainbow Coalition. So both of those things were happening in Uptown in the 60s, several years before we got there. There was also, Uptown was one of, I can't remember how many, maybe 4 or 5 communities. It's probably in the book, but I don't remember the exact number. In the city of Chicago that got Model Cities money. Model Cities was part of President Johnson's war on poverty. And so if based on the various different demographics that included poverty, cities across the country got funds to be able to spend in addition to other monies they had specifically focused on addressing poverty. And in Chicago, there were 4 or 5 communities. Uptown was the only one that was majority white. But as I've said, it was pretty diverse. I didn't even mention everybody who lived here. I just realized. So it was one of the Model Cities areas. What that meant was that the Daley administration, this is Old Man Daley, the original Richard J. Daley machine, who created the Democratic machine after he became mayor in 1955, and he didn't see any federal dollars that he didn't ever love and covet and use for the purposes of strengthening the machine, adding on patronage, and providing sustenance to favored contractors. Mostly the cement contractors did really well in Uptown. But he was constantly, his planning department would, as I said earlier, identify where somebody could really do some good business and figure out a way to help them do it. And it was also their way of moving people around that they really didn't want to keep in the city anymore, or they wanted to be in a different location. So when it came to public housing, they built the high rises. That's a whole other story I can get into. In Uptown, they decided to build a city college. It was initially just called City College. It was going to be it was Mayfair College they were going to replace and bring to a new location, but it didn't have a name, and it was initially going to take up about the entire area from Wilson to Montrose, the L train west to at least Magnolia, and so it was a pretty large area. There was huge opposition to it. There were a group of white liberals who negotiated a compromise. And basically the compromise was that the college would build one building and they would do it just on that one block. But we knew, which was Clifton to Racine, Montrose to Sunnyside. Now we knew that, everyone, well, I can't speak, I wasn't there yet. But in retrospect, we knew they weren't going to do that. And when I got there, we knew they weren't going to hold to that. So there was a lot of, I'm saying this to say there was a lot of people struggling around this. People were taking different positions, and some people were losing, some people were winning. And meanwhile, there were a lot of really poor people who had nothing and who were were in the midst of an incredible amount of violence against themselves and their homes. And that violence took the form of arson. It took the form, I mean, literally, some of the stories that I got from people's mouths who experienced this was, I woke up in the morning, lived in a 2-flat, down the street, half a block from the fire station. I woke up in the morning, my house was on fire. The fire department didn't come for an hour. Woke up in the morning and I heard noise and the building was shaking, and I went to look and they'd torn down the front steps and I couldn't get out of my house. That was just over and over and over again. I've heard stories like that. Not besides the ones where people were actually in the building when the fire was there and did or didn't make it out.
Can I just tell people how often these fires were happening? Throughout the 1970s, devastating fires struck uptown on average once every 3 days.
Okay, but this is after the 60s. So this started in 68. I'm talking about when I was there.
Yeah.
So this had already started in 68. By the time I got there, that block that I talked about where the college was going to be built, the one that they finally agreed on, was completely vacant. And for the longest time, just was covered with abandoned cars, and therefore lots of rats. And also, what do you call them? Wild cats and dogs. So it was hard to walk around. You had to really be careful. You had to make sure you weren't in the way of any packs of dogs or cats, and the rats were everywhere in everyone's homes. So, but they weren't concerned with any of that, and people were very poor. And some people were able to work, but a lot of people living in Uptown at that time were sick. There were a lot of people that come from the South, had worked in the mines. They were now in Uptown with black lung, or someone in their family had black lung. The housing conditions were horrific, so it was very common for there to be salmonella poison, for there to be lead poisoning. It was a constant issue. Now, what I have to say is that was true in Pilsen. It was true in Lawndale. We had our mortality rate, and Lawndale's was the highest mortality rate in the city at that point in time, the early 70s, 25% mortality rate. It was really horrific. And we didn't have any tenant laws. We didn't have any rights that anyone had. What we had was a machine. Precinct captains who, when you attempted, the first thing that happened to me when I got to Chicago was canvassing. I was doing a home distribution route for the paper, but I was mostly just trying to get a lay of the land, and I couldn't believe the conditions people were in when they let us into their apartment. So I started talking to people about, well, we should do something about it, and maybe we should do a tenant union, whatever. We were just chatting. The next week when I came back, nobody would open their door to me. And I came to find out that the precinct captain had followed me, or some precinct had followed me to every door after I'd been there and threatened people. So people were afraid of losing their welfare or being kicked out of their apartment or losing their job or whatever it was. Somebody had something for everyone. So we had to get serious and figure out how were we going to really deal with this and organize people and get to some change. But that was the conditions when we got there. On the other side, there had been a lot of organizing, and there were a lot of people doing a lot of stuff. We didn't interact with everyone, and we were very cautious about it because some of the people doing stuff we knew were part of the Red Squad, and they were just doing it for manipulation, and other people it was crazy. We didn't know the lay of the land. We had to figure it out. And in the course of doing that, we just focused on programs we were creating based on conversations we had, and what attracted me to Chicago and attracted me to the Intercommunal Survival Committee was that we were going to focus on the people in the community, and we weren't going to get involved in sectarian politics. I was really done with them after the SDS split in 1968, and I didn't want to have anything, and I was in Madison, Wisconsin, and that was the last thing I wanted. So that's what attracted me here. And that's what we did, and that's how we figured out really what to do. The Black Panther Party had many different programs. They came out of the community. It was a great, sort of framework to follow, and that's what we did. But those are conditions, and nothing changes overnight. And people, it is really the power of people. The forces change, but that's not something that happens overnight. But in the process of doing it, people are able to really improve their lives because they get support. And if nothing else, they have moral support, they have relationships, they have new ideas, they find ways in which to help each other and to create, and to be part of creating that help in the community or that dynamic in the community. So it's all part of who we are and what we do. And that's really what we had to do as we were thinking we were going to have a revolution in a few years, and then as we realized we weren't, and that we were in it for the long haul, and we had to figure out how we were going to function in a way that would really make a difference. And I have to say that that's something I have to figure out over and over and over again, as I suppose most of you do as well. But yeah, so that was Uptown in 1972. The young patriots had several encounters with the police. I talk about this in the book, so you can read about some of the specifics. And I also talk about a lot of the interactions that I had with them as an activist, as just a member of the Intercommunal Survival Committee, as somebody in Uptown, attempting to deal with racism when some members of the police were involved in organizing around the Klan and handing out literature actually from the Nazi Party. And then struggling in a new Washington administration to get some of that stuff addressed, and having the conversation with Harold Washington where he said, I don't control the police department, Helen. That's why we have to deal with institutional racism and institutional corruption. This is going to take some time. And then having to deal with that on my own after he dies, and not being a little naive in some cases, thinking, all we had to do was just say what was happening and somebody would respond, and that's not the way it works. So a lot of that is in the book, and I talk about it largely because I think it's really important that we find a way to be able to address this. I was talking to a friend, a very dear friend, who's actually mentioned in the book, who's not doing very well right now, a couple weeks ago. And we were talking about what it would really take to make the change that we need so that we really did have public safety in our communities. And the point he made to me, which I realize is reflected in almost all of my experiences, was that, the police are on both sides of this. Not all the police, but the institution, and therefore everyone. So we have this, well, let me start here. We have this point of view often that I know better than you know, or there is somehow the right way, and so it's us versus them. I know the right way, they don't. I'm smart, they're stupid. We know the right way, they're down the wrong path. We're the angels, they're the devil, whatever it is. But when we have that kind of relationship to other people, and we're all people and we all make mistakes, and we all have to make mistakes in order to learn. But when we have that kind of perspective, we don't give people the chance to make mistakes. We demonize them for who they are and their attempt to be able to become who they need to be, because that requires change. And how do you make change? You test the waters. You figure out if something works or not. If it doesn't work, you redo it. When if you're among those people that when you're young you have a chance to make mistakes and be forgiven, you have a different road ahead of you than you're among those people who, when you're young and you make a mistake, you're not forgiven. You're punished for it. And that sets the tone for moving forward. But when we're in it, all of that represents this very encouragement of a very judgmental attitude that creates an us versus them. And the problem with us versus them is that nobody is an angel and nobody is a devil, that we all make mistakes. Some of us have better intents in circumstances than others, and some have worse intents. We can identify that. we can address it, we can figure out how to deal with it. But if we approach it always with the assumption that it's them versus you versus me, us versus them, they're wrong, I'm right, where is the common ground or the middle ground where we can come and see what's what and where we can go from here? And if we think about it, I mean, oh my God, just think about everything going on in the world. Think about what was true 10 years ago and what's true today. Probably very different things. I mean, we just had a Martin Luther King holiday, right? And we're talking about all, we talk about what he represented, but he was demonized. He was demonized, and everything he was doing was illegal. And so there's a different attitude about it today. Well, that's a change, and it seems to me that one of the main things we should learn from that change is that what we think is evil or bad or illegal today may not be tomorrow. Think about all the cannabis stuff. So we have so many examples of it in our lifetime. And I think that therefore we have to have the same we have to look at ourselves and our institutions in the same way. We're human beings and we're there. So we have this institution. We have this institution that we somehow think is going to provide us with public safety in our community, but again and again we feel that we find a contradiction. We find again and again that we're not getting public safety. We call them for help, but we don't know if we're going to get it when we call them. That we expect certain things are going to happen, but we never really know if they are. If we're on that one side of the divide where we had a chance to make mistakes when we're young and went down one path because we weren't demonized for the mistakes, we might have a slightly different relationship today with them, with the police, the institution of the police, than if we were in that other group that was not allowed to make mistakes and was demonized for them, or somewhere in between. So it was, you have different extremes and everything in between. The point I'm making, I think, is that in our experience, and what George was saying to me, just think about it, Helen, every one of our experiences, we could see both sides of it. We could see the police involved on both sides of it. That's an institutional thing. That's what Harold was talking about when he talked about institutional racism and corruption. That's what I found again and again when I talked about different things that we were doing in my experiences that related to the police, that when I raised the question, I was either made to feel like or be treated like I was the problem, not that they were, or not that there was something that had to be changed. When I tried to get involved in the police contract, so here's the thing about the police contract. From the very first contract that was signed, it was said that the alderman could review the contract, but no one could change anything past 30 days from the time that the police union members voted to accept the contract. We never got the contract before the city council in less than 30 days. That meant we could never do anything but vote yes. We didn't even have the right to vote no. I mean, you could have. I think I might have once or twice, but you didn't have the right to do it. The council as a whole didn't have the right to make a change. And I didn't actually discover that until I was writing the book, and I went and analyzed all of the police contracts up until that point. And from the very beginning, the contract, as it was a contract, it was with a police union. The union's job is to protect its members, and think of any, it's the interests of its members. But where is the interest of the public? It's a little bit different thing. And there was over and over and over again in that initial contract that was signed when Jane Byrne was mayor, really basically gave away the vote. But it continued to do that year after year after year. And there's a lot of reasons for it, and I can go into it maybe, but it would take a long time. But I think that, and I can answer questions about it, but I think that was the beginning. That was a very important core issue. And when later on, I realized that finally, I asked Fredrina Lyle, who was another alderman at the time and just been appointed to be my partner. She was a civil rights attorney. I asked her, be my partner and in going in and insinuating ourselves into the contract process. So they had to let us sit in with some of the conversations with the with the attorneys that the outside attorneys the city had involved in doing the negotiating. I think they're using the same outside attorneys, 30 years later, and maybe more. And they were it was really a struggle. They didn't want to make any change. They kept telling us it wasn't possible. The biggest excuse was that if we try and put these things in that you're talking about, we'll have to go to arbitration, we'll lose it in arbitration. So they were kind of negotiating with themselves instead of the police in advance. The one thing you never want to do if you really want change, right? They had to know that. They're lawyers who engage in this all the time. So ultimately, the one thing we were focused on was broadening the length of time that the city had to include history of a police officer's activities when looking at their record. And it started out as 6 months, and half the time you didn't even get to an investigation until after 6 months. We got it extended, not long enough. I thought this was off, sorry. But we did get it extended, but the reason we got it extended, it was after at least 2 attempts, and we got them to include it in the contract negotiations because it was clear they were already going to arbitration. So this wasn't going to be the reason they went to arbitration, and the arbitrator accepted it, and that's how we got it. It was, after all these years of us fighting it. Anyway, I've totally gone around the block, and the point I really was trying to make was that we need a real institutional change, and that is deeper than just changing the superintendent, although it would require, in this instance, doing that. But it also really requires looking at what we want the police to do, what their real role is, who it is that we really need to count on to make changes to respond to public service, public safety needs that we have, and to look at the breadth of public safety and start you can never start with a fresh slate, but actually, at least in a conversation of sorts, start with what it takes to really get from every community in the city what the essence is really of what they need to feel safe. And to the extent that that is objective and not just somebody's, prejudicial approach to something, we need to understand if it is, because then we know we have to address that, but you don't address that with the police. Or to what extent it is about real safety that has to do with violence, and what is that violence? If the violence is coming from a landlord, then we have to address it there. If the violence is coming from the fact that someone doesn't have food, we have to address it there. If the violence is coming from an example or a situation of domestic violence, then we have to address that there. But all of those, if the violence is coming because someone is experiencing PTSD for any number of 100 different reasons, we need to address that as well. And that means we need to identify what are the resources that we need to have available to actually do these things, and to what extent, and who really does that, who is that, where does that fall in all of this? And by doing that, maybe we'll get to see what the police really need to do, and maybe we'll get to see what other people or institutions need to do. I don't know. But the conversation isn't there, because every time someone brings it up, they find a way to demonize it, or, which was George's point, coming back to it, sorry, it'll be disrupted by those officers that like it the way it is, because they have the ability to do that. So we have to be aware that it'll be undermined, because no one likes change. Institutions don't like change. They want to perpetuate themselves. And I think that is a really important notion for us to address, and be able to confront in one way or another. Now, so that was my point. Maybe I made it, maybe not, I hope. But I want to say this. I worked really hard at developing a relationship with you deal with the world you're in, right? You have to deal with the hand you're dealt. And I thought it would be really important. I'm an alderman. I needed to have a relationship with the police commanders. And I worked really hard at trying to do that, at least to have a conversation. And there were a few commanders who I was able, two in particular, that I realized that actually we had monthly meetings, we'd have monthly breakfast, and we would talk, and we would hear each other. And in that context, it became clear to me that there were some things they could do and some things they couldn't do, because truthfully, they'd only go as far as the command structure would allow, and the command structure was very limiting. And they on the one hand, I understood that it was their military operation, but on the other hand, they're in a civilian setting. And so that was something we struggled with a lot, but it also led to some serious problem solving around a few different examples. And it was very different. These were problem solvings that I couldn't do through CAPS, because CAPS was not an even playing field to work on, and it was an echo chamber. It wasn't an even playing field. But I was able to do it in a few instances, and I do write about them in the book. One is the story about the homeless task force, and that's important because the outcome. I described the whole thing, but what we did with the police commander, but and the city's Department of what was then Human Services, Emergency Services. But what was important about that was that, and the lesson was that the commander asked he asked for 2 volunteers. So 2 beat cops volunteered to work solely with the homeless, there were a lot of homeless in Uptown. And they ended up being advocates for them and getting into all sorts of arguments with their fellow colleagues. And it was, now that ended when he left and went on to, when he got promoted or whatever. When he was no longer the commander of that district. And we tried to do some similar things. The next commander, not so much, and then another one who we did some other stuff with. But to me, it was a really learning experience, both because it showed what was possible, and it showed how important relationships are, but also how you can't just do something with a couple people, that you really have to go way beyond that. I think there's probably a few other examples like that.
So to kind of bring together a couple different things, and this can maybe be our last question before a little bit of audience Q&A. You mentioned one of the things you told me that Harold told you was it was his opinion that it was going to take 20 years to make real substantive change around structural racism and all these sort of, again, the institutions that don't want to change. You also talked a lot about, as you said, the belief that revolution is imminent in the early 70s as you're coming to Chicago, realizing that it's not. One of the things that we talked about was the Huey Newton survival pending revolution, this idea of creating the structures so people can just keep living in the conditions of deprivation that they were facing. You then are in office for 24 years and working inside of a system that is not especially built towards revolution, and yet you still did a lot of great work within that system, and most of it without Harold, of course. You only had about a year with him in office. So these are a couple big things kind of tied together, but we're in this moment right now where we have our own next city election in next month. I know a lot of people are thinking a lot about the values of electoral politics, the hopes that we have for putting some better people in office, because there are a lot of vacancies, but also very much the limitations. And so I guess because you're very good at riffing and going off in a lot of different directions, I'll leave you with that and see what you make of it, all of these different things.
Well, okay. So in November, I had a lot of conversations with people because I was encouraging people to vote, and my point about that was that sometimes you have to vote defensively, or sometimes voting is a defensive action, and I think that I especially felt that way this November. I've been feeling that way this last couple of years. I feel like I start the book with a story about fascism, and I think I did that intentionally because I think that it's something we really need to be very wary of and concerned with, and defend against. And I can't believe actually I'm saying this, but I've said it over and over again that I do think that voting actually, even for some people that we might have to hold our nose to vote for, if they are in any way, shape, or form in a position to disrupt that forward movement of the right, which is really a backward movement, we need to do that. We need to take whatever action there is while we do whatever organizing we need to be doing, hopefully winning over hearts and minds of people who have a different perspective. I think that I have this thing that I talk about a lot, which is having a sea to swim in. I think elected officials need a sea to swim in. I think anybody in a position of power in any institution needs a sea to swim in, and hopefully that see as one that encourages a forward humanistic movement as opposed to a backward right-wing kind of return to the past, anti-human rights, etc. kind of movement. We're faced in this country with a Supreme Court that has a majority on it that have stated publicly that they think we should return to the origins of the Constitution of the United States. Now, to me, what that means is the origins were we are creating a country where the rights of people are defined by whether or not they are wealthy. In those days, it meant owning property, but you have to have a lot of wealth to own property, that they're white, that they are men. So if you did not have a lot of wealth, if you were a woman, and if you were not white, you did not have citizenship here. But if you were white and didn't have property, you could get it. And if you were a man and were able to get property, then you were a full citizen. If you were anyone else, if you were a slave and brought here, it's not the same as if you were white and brought here on a chattel contract, because you could get out of the chattel contract. But if you were a slave, you could not. And the foundation of the country and the Constitution, as it was initially put together, was put together explicitly to ensure that slavery would be legal for as long as possible and that it could be expanded. And that the power of the slaveholders would be, political power would be enshrined in the Constitution. That's why we have a Senate. And that's why again and again and again, the legacy of that has reared its head, not just through Jim Crow in the southern states, but through national legislation that was passed for Social Security, for housing acts. In almost all of them, there are specific exceptions that exclude benefits that people were able to receive in the North that they couldn't receive in the South, based on race. And so that we have a situation where there's an incredible amount of institutional racism and institutional corruption that is tied explicitly to the foundation of the country and repeated in every institution, in every state, in every city in the country. Harold knew this. He lived it, he breathed it, he fought it. And when he became mayor of the city of Chicago, he said that his top priorities would be the elimination of institutional racism and institutional corruption. And he was very clear every time he said that, and very careful to make the point that nothing changes overnight, that that's at least a 20-year, I think it probably is longer, process, that internal change and internalization were both necessary and they wouldn't just happen like that. But that once he was elected, he also said that the day he was elected, that the grades of children or the level of education of children throughout the city, and especially in the Black community, would be elevated immediately, because he knew that that would mean that people saw a future for themselves and they would really go have at it. And he was right. There was a whole sort of renaissance and a dynamic that was focused on transforming the schools, as well as many other things. So there was the reform of the schools, there was opening up government for people throughout the city, they were creating new ways in which people could participate with the city, there was new legislation being proposed by him, or rules for the city and minority contracting. There were all these different things that he was putting in motion that couldn't be turned back after he died, but didn't get an opportunity to be realized fully while he was alive, including gang intervention and a series of other activities that created, there were people doing stuff that he was actually going to fund for the first time in the budget that he died and got moved out of the budget, that were on a much more even playing field than any of the later caps, because it was not the police department running it, but it was people doing stuff in the community that was then interfacing with the police and other city departments to find solutions to some of the issues that were there. And I have to tell you, if you look at a chart of violent crimes in the city of Chicago, over a 20-year period, that the 4 of the 20 years that had 3 of the 4 lowest levels of violence in the city during that 20-year period of time was when he was mayor. So I think that these things are so much bigger than what we think they are. You know, we always pinpoint one thing, and they're so much harder to get at because they get distorted. They get distorted in the political ads. It's why anyone with an ounce of sense doesn't listen to the political ads, because they're meaningless unless someone's actually talking about themselves. And then maybe you get a sense of whether you think they're telling the truth or not. I think that and that goes back to my point about a sea to swim in. I think that as an elected official, I was much more effective at being able to get things done when there was a sea for me to swim in. I welcomed people coming from my left or wherever they came from that were critical of what I was doing, even if in the end I knew they didn't understand what I was doing. It was my job to clarify what it was. But often it didn't matter, because by their push, I was able to get what I could get. It wasn't necessarily everything we wanted, but there was a material impact. So for me, it became an issue of, is there a material impact here? And is it worth what you're giving up? And is it taking, and from that process, can we go a step further and be able to build on that? So it's always about building a sea to be able to swim in. That means we all, every single one of us in this room, has a responsibility to be part of building that sea. And I think the best example we can have of our failure to do so is the success of the right, who's been very successful over the last 20, 30 years to having done that. They built the sea to swim in that now is really, that certainly Trump took advantage of. He understood this, or instinctively, if not, actually. And but they used him as well in order to be able to create this, to get the political power necessary. Look what we got in the Supreme Court. It makes no sense. They do not represent by any way, shape, or means the majority of people in this country, but they have the power to enforce rules for us that are absolutely unacceptable to most of us. We have to turn that around, and the only way we can turn that around is by changing that sea. And having said that, we're moving mountains, but mountains are moved one shovelful at a time. So we need to have a perspective, a long-term perspective on that. But we also need to believe that anything is possible and we can make it done. But we need people to do it, which means we need to be talking to other people and we need to be clarifying and as quickly as we possibly can and as simply as we possibly can those things that we have in common and some of the more obvious things that we can actually do when we have stuff in common, and why it is that we need to get past those things that get in our way. Sea to swim in.
Yes, that's great.
Yeah.
Mandy, what do you think? A little bit of audience Q&A?
Yeah, we have like 10 to 15 minutes.
Okay. All right, who would like to, I see a hand, yes.
How would you judge what had happened to the black and white coalition that you worked on in '72, and what do you think was the main aspect or factor of that judgment since then?
Of bad judgment or of that judgment? Well, I didn't understand the last sentence. What judgment?
What do you say has happened to that coalition since then?
To the coalition?
That coalition was a big part of the coalition that of forces that elected Harold Washington.
Sure.
Harold Washington was uniquely suited to provide a leadership that kind of was some real glue for that. But, there's a political world and things change. And there were a lot of people that took advantage of, after he died, of the fact that we no longer had that singular leadership that could hold everything together, and really took advantage of how do I say this? Of the fissures that were there and worked hard at exploding them. So I think that that hasn't changed the fact that we have a lot in common, and that there are common issues. But when there are people that are always trying that when so one of the dynamics that happened for me in terms of my circle of friends and people that I interacted with and colleagues, not all friends, was that what I saw was that there were people that were taking advantage of exploding the differences in order to explode the coalition. And there were, I can speak for myself when I can say that it was breaking my heart while I couldn't figure out how to get past that. Because I saw them taking advantage of people's emotions. And once your emotions go too far and someone else's emotions go too far, you cross a line. And I didn't know how to, I didn't myself know what it took to prevent that. Someone else smarter might have been able to do it, but that was what was happening at that time. So bringing it up to today, what I and some of this is cross generations, like we were just Annie and I were talking coming in here about housing stuff, and what I realize is that on housing alone, and I think this is true for almost every issue, I'm sure it's true for the police and other stuff, that we all have different experiences and we have a different slice of what that experience is, and we learn different lessons from it. And I'm not so sure that we are understanding each other's experiences or the experiences of the different communities and how that fits together. We are still, that a lot of the institutions that were created in the midst of struggling around change are now old. And when something perpetuates itself, it wants to continue to perpetuate itself. So we're in this constant process of, I think, of just like in we think of ourselves as progressive, and we relate back to the things that we were involved in creating and the things that people are trying to do today. And sometimes it's not so easy to separate from that. I'm speaking for myself. And or I don't realize how much change has happened and how something that was once vibrant is not vibrant anymore. And so there's a constant need to be for turnover and for change in the way we're thinking about stuff that's really rooted in the very needs and realities that people have. And I say all that because I think that anything is possible. I think that those coalitions are still there to be made. And I think that we have the potential for that in our future. And I'm very hopeful in that regard. We have a situation with our city that there are municipal elections which are going to turn around, the Chicago City Council is going to look different in 3 or 4 months than it does today. Now, what that difference is up to all of us in the city in our different wards. But the potential there is there for so much. And so, once again, I want to stress, it is up to us, I think, on a grassroots basis, to be able to create the connections and create the demand for the kind of city we want, which includes people communicating across communities to solve common problems and to understand the nuances, because that's part of the problem. We have one over here, there's one set of problems, and over here there's another set of problems. It is not a given that the solution to those has to be in conflict, but it is a given that somebody is going to try and make it seem that way to ensure that there isn't that connection made and therefore real solutions found. It is incumbent upon us who want to see those changes, want to see that connection, want to find real solutions, to build the seed to allow that to happen. That's what I think.
You said it a lot better than I would, but I agree with you looking across that same period.
Other questions?
I do. I have a question. I grew up here in Pilsen, and in the early 70s, at Casa Aslan, they were brown race.
Yeah.
Was there a connection with the Black Panthers? I was too young to know what was going on politically, but I would be at the front desk handing people their charts and doing my part. But was there a connection with the Brown Berets
Well,
and Black Panthers?
we used to bring the Black Panther paper over to Casa Salon all the time. I mean, that was a lot of where we had the meetings with Casa also.
Okay.
So I always considered the Brown Berets and Casa to be like a brother or sister organizations. And they clearly had a relationship. You could correct me if I'm wrong, Lupe.
No.
And so, yeah, I mean, so so the Black Panther Party chapter in Chicago, along with chapters all over the country, were called back to Oakland in 1973. And then after, in 1975, latter part of 1975, some of the members came back to Chicago and started up a chapter again here for a few years. And, but so they were, you know, so that we were selling the papers here during that time, and then
There wasn't
people
like
came back and
there wasn't like a coalition or anything because we had a clinic. We had a free health
well,
clinic.
so did they, and all the
And so
clinics
did
were
Black Panthers.
all the clinics were connected.
So, but there wasn't anything coordinated within the groups.
I think
No.
that there was, I'm sure there was I mean, we had communication, so I'm sure they did too. And I mean, I have to go back and look at the papers, but they reflect, you know, the Black Panther Party papers, which were printed through the early part of 1980, I think, always reflected some stuff that was going on in Chicago. We sent them stories and they ran, you know, they got stuff from different people, but, and I have to go back and look and see what was in there. But there definitely, I mean, the paper, what we distributed the paper between us and the Black Panther Party members, we distributed the paper to organizations all over the city, and I know we brought papers to Pilsen and to Casa Salon, among other places. So
I just
and
never saw.
yeah, well, but the
But I was in high school, yeah.
but the real point is that the programs fed off of each
They were
other.
similar.
And they were
Exactly.
not just similar, but they came from a similar place. And I think
Yeah.
that was really important. The ideology of the party, the 10-point platform and program, was something that I think everybody who was doing anything at the time read and knew and drew from because it was relevant to each of our communities. Yeah. It may not have been something that was like, this is what we're doing. And the Rainbow Coalition was something that was a phenomenon of 68, although they did refer to us later on in the stuff we did as a continuation of it. But yeah, I think that there was definitely a connection, if only by our actions.
Another question.
Huh? Yeah, it was based on solidarity, absolutely.
I see Vitaly has a question.
I guess I'm just wondering, like, have you been wanting to write a book for a really long time? Like, why now? Like, the timing of it? I'm just curious about, like, just what you've been up to, if you want to mention that.
Yeah, so there were people that were close to me that were pushing me to write a book when I was first leaving the city council, but I wasn't ready. And in 2018, I broke my foot. So I started writing stories because they kept pushing me, and I was off my feet for a while. But then so as a result of that, I also had, I had a friend who was pushing me to do a photo book, a book of photos. I have thousands of photos, about 10.
Tell them about the boxes in your basement.
I have 200 and some boxes. They're about to be at the University of Chicago. A circle is taking my archives, and then they're going to do a thing on them in March. But anyway, so I actually spent 3 months, or maybe it was 4, in the winter in Cape Cod in a cottage alone, and there's no one in Cape Cod in the winter, just going through about 15,000 negatives, which is maybe 5% of what I have, trying to figure out if I was going to do a book or not, and I was creating a database. And meanwhile, this is 2018, so it's the winter 2018, so it's during the primaries for when Sanders and Clinton were running against each other, and I'm in New England, and that's Sanders territory, and so there was constant conversation. I mean, I didn't have a TV or anything, so it was just the radio, and there was constant noise that I was hearing about the election and the primary, and I really started to get nervous because what was clear was that they were going to be attacking each other, and that I did not see how that was going to end up with a Democratic victory. In the fall, I was sure that Trump was going to win. And I got really discouraged. And that was the beginning of me really being worried about fascism. And and then So I'm working on stuff with the book. I get started, actually do an intro and blah, blah, blah. And then the pandemic hit and I got serious because I had time and that's all I did. But that was the motivation. And everything that happened when Trump was president got me closer to writing another story. But that was really my motivation.
Because I've always been, as an Uptown resident, I've been frustrated because what's his name, Bob Rehack, who has the photo book of Uptown. I know that his work it's beautiful, but it's kind of staged a little bit. I was told that like to make Uptown seem really destitute in the 1970s, like way more so. So it's.
I don't know if he made it more so. I think he was pretty accurate. But we do have, and he captured a few of our guys. I do have lots of pictures, and they'll probably, I think we're going to start putting them on the website.
I tried to license some of his photos when I worked at the Chamber of Commerce, and he just was not a very nice person to deal with. He now just lives in Florida.
No, he lives in Texas, actually.
Okay.
I called him because I thought I wanted to do something with photos, but he's not ready. He's sick. So we're not gonna do it.
I think
What struck me most tonight is what you said about the old demons becoming the heroes. If you could put that into a book and write about it, I think you could start out with Cassius Clay and Muhammad Ali. He was an enemy of the people. He went to jail, and now he's on billboards, and he's considered the top athlete of the second half of the century, big cultural hero.
Yep.
Boy, if you could put that in a bottle or a book.
All right. Any final thoughts, Helen? Maybe I shouldn't ask you. That might be 20
No,
more
I
minutes from you.
I think that I really want to stress again this notion of building a sea to swim in, and the fact that we all have responsibility. And the one thing about that I didn't say is that when someone is elected, I don't care what you elect them to, we think that they can do everything we want to do. I mean, every dream we have. You know, we thought Harold could do every dream we had of the city. People thought that I could do every dream we had of what you could do as an alderman. And that's just not the case. But the sea that's created has a lot to do with what we're able to do. And so we have to be careful about criticizing someone when we don't give them that sea. If we don't give them the sea and they don't take it, have at them. But it's really important that we have this, understand that there's this symbiotic relationship. And we have as much responsibility as the people we elect. And we really need to honor that both ways. Vice versa, they need to honor it too.
I think that's a lovely sentiment to end on. Well, lovely, timely, considering the election coming up. I want to thank you again so much.
Thank you. Is there anyone in this room running for the police thing? Whatever it's called, the new police thing?
Yeah.
Does anyone know anyone running?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
The Reader this week has a voter guide. Let's check that out.
Okay. Yeah, check it out. Wherever you are, I'll check it out for sure.
Yeah, and there's so much more of this history in this book, which we have up at the counter. Also, Annie has some wonderful writings of hers here.
Yes.
And is doing a fundraiser as well. Annie, do you want to?
Yeah, so I'm getting facial feminization surgery in early March. Without insurance, it'd be $140,000. With insurance, it's a lot less, thankfully. And a lot of people have chipped in already. My lovely partner is modeling a sweater that they made, and they're raffling off a sweater, up to 3 entries, $10 per entry.
It'll be completely custom.
Yes. Whatever you want. And I've got some of my writing that's Pay What You Want to help chip in. So, thank you. Thank you.